Hey y'all, it's Jordan, and today we're talking about how to put that next big bass in your boat this fall. Let's dive right into it. Okay, so this fall, what bait do you need to catch your next big bass? Is it a topwater bite? Is it going to be a spinner bait bite? Is it going to be a swim bait bite? Is it going to be a crankbait, deep diving crankbait, jig, finesse? Who knows, right? Well, don't let fall get too complicated for you. For any of those of you that like to fish early spring when the water temps are still really cool, this should be really familiar territory to you guys. I know there are a few different, factors as far as the fall, like the fish aren't gearing up towards the spawn, stuff like that. But as those water temps cool, these fish are going to push up shallow, similar to what you see in the spring. So whenever it comes to the best bait for the fall, there's several different baits. Topwater, this is a great time of year for topwater. This is also a great time of year for deeper diving crankbaits. I don't really do a lot of finesse fishing in the fall. Don't get me wrong. I do if I need to, if the fish certainly aren't biting on anything more aggressive. But whenever it comes to catching your next big fish in the fall, don't be scared to throw those bigger, more aggressive baits this time of year. The fish are feeding heavier. They're getting ready for winter. They're getting, things are going to get colder. They know that. So the fish are going to be feeding up really soon. And this is the time to start using those more aggressive baits to try to get those larger fish. So what's my favorite baits in the fall? Honestly, when it comes to fall fishing, I really love to try to go after a topwater bite. I think it's one of the best times of year to go after an aggressive topwater bite, and a buzz bait is really my preferred method. I know that some people don't like how quick a buzz bait moves, and honestly, if I don't feel that the fish are that aggressive to be chasing a buzz bait, I do like a good popping bait or a whopper plopper where I can still get that noise and that action that you would get out of a buzz bait with a whopper plopper, but I can slow it down. I can pop it a little bit. I don't have to worry about it sinking. I can keep it in the strike zone longer. But if I'm covering water, one of my favorite ways to cover water and have fun is with a buzzbait. And when I'm throwing a buzzbait, I like a heavier rod. I like a 7'4" to a 7'6", medium heavy with a fast or moderate action tip. I typically throw it on monofilament, usually at least 15-pound test or more. And how I determine when I want to throw a buzzbait, it's honestly one of my starting baits that I go with. Like I said, when I'm covering water, when I'm trying to figure the fish out, a buzzbait's really a good starting bait. One of my second favorites, especially this time of year, is a square bill crankbait. With the square bill crankbait, again, you can cover a lot of water efficiently. It triggers those reaction bites. And this time of year, when the fish are feeding more aggressively, especially up shallow the way that they are, a square bill crankbait can be an absolute killer whenever it comes to catching not just a lot of fish, but big fish. Whenever I throw a square bill crankbait, I typically throw it on a 7 foot to a 7'4". Medium, I really don't go over a medium. I might go to a medium heavy depending on how big the crankbait is. Fast action tip. I throw it with a lighter pound line, as you have seen in some of my previous videos. Typically, when I throw a square bill crankbait, I throw it on 8 or 10-pound test fluorocarbon. So when do I pick a square bill? Honestly, just like the buzzbait, it's one of the key baits that I use to search for bass this time of year. A square bill isn't only good year round, but this time of year is probably one of the first three baits that I'm going to throw. It'll probably be a buzz bait, a square bill, and then a swim jig or swim bait of some sort. As far as determining when or where I'm going to throw it, I really look for some of that murkier water. I look for a lot of cover that I can throw it through, somewhere where I can really make a lot of noise. 6 foot of water or less typically, or if I can find some grass that I can hit the tops of it with, it's in 10 foot of water. I really like to throw it around gravel. I really like to throw it around primary and secondary points. Square bills can be absolutely lethal, and they work, honestly, in my opinion, they work in their prime whenever they're near some sort of current, like in a primary or secondary point. And like I said, the third bait that I'm going to go to is a swim jig. This time of year, bass are typically feeding on shad or bait fish of some sort. A swim jig is just really universal. You can use it in so many different applications, so many different depths. If you don't like the color that you're using, it's really easy to change out the plastic trailer that you're using to adjust color or adjust size. There's just so many different reasons that I like to go with a swim jig this time of year. Whenever it comes to where I'm going to throw it at, like I said, it's going to be probably the third bait that I'm going to throw. It's going to be my third option, especially if I get near deeper water. It's going to move up to more of one of my primary options because, as I've mentioned in previous videos, buzz baits don't really work well in anything over 10 foot of water. Square bills, obviously, if you get over 6 foot of water or however deep they're made to go, if they're not hitting bottom or hitting some sort of structure, square bills really aren't that effective. When it comes to how I like to set up my swim jigs, I really like a heavier rod for this. Still a 7 foot to a 7'4", but I always stay with a medium heavy or even a heavy moderate action tip. When it comes to the type of line that I like to use for a swim jig, again, I like 15 to 18 pound test fluorocarbon. I like to stick to a heavier line whenever I'm using the swim jig because you're going to come around a lot of cover. A lot of times when you're throwing a swim jig, you're throwing it around brush piles, you're throwing it around gravel, or you're throwing it around grass. And with any kind of situation like that, with all the stuff that's going to be nicking and cutting on your line, especially if you're aiming for that next big bite, going with a stronger line never hurts. And with a moving bait, don't worry, those fish aren't going to see that line, especially when it comes to these reaction bites. I'm not going to argue that when it comes to finesse bites, that going to a lighter line doesn't help, but you're only going to be hurting yourself if you use a tactic like one of those three, chasing a big or a large bite, and you're using a smaller line, especially if you're fishing by yourself and you got to net that thing by yourself. You're really going to be in a world of hurt, and you're really going to be upset whenever that thing breaks off. And we've all been there. I'm speaking to you from my own personal experience. I like to rig these baits up. Well, universally, with every bait that I just mentioned, I'm going to use a Palomar knot. Not just because of the technique I'm using, but because it's fluorocarbon line. Anytime that I'm using fluorocarbon, a polymer knot's almost the only go-to for me. I just think that you have less of a chance of breaking it. I know there's other connector knots like the FG knot and stuff like that, and I'm not going to argue that those don't work great. I use them personally as well, but whenever it comes tying directly to the bait itself, if you're using fluorocarbon, I promise you, doing a polymer knot is going to save you so much heartache in the end, especially if you're one of the people that like to do like the old twist knot. That's really not going to work with fluorocarbon. I'm not saying that some of the other knots aren't just as stable, but the polymer knot is my preferred whenever it comes to fluorocarbon. When it comes to rigging up my buzz bait, this is the kind of buzz bait that I like to use. As you can tell, I don't use a skirt. Most of the time when I'm throwing a buzz bait, I do throw it skirtless. And as you can tell, there's a couple modifications there that I've learned just over the course of time from watching different videos. I will say, if you notice how this is bent down here like this, if you take a pair of pliers to your buzz bait and kink it like that and put this part down in the water more, you're going to save yourself a few heartaches, and you're not going to have as many fish miss or not get a hold of the hook. When it comes to the kind of trailer I like to use, I just like to use these little Strike King grubs right here, and I just thread it up on the hook, put a little dab of super glue on it, and when it comes to the retrieve, it's typically just a straight cast and retrieve with a few sudden, pops or stops, stuff like that, a few erratic motions. But for the most part, I just try to go nice and slow as I can go, and keep the bait on top of the water with just a few subtle motions is the best way to throw a buzz bait. And like I said, make sure you put a little dab of super glue right there, or else you're going to waste a lot of money in these trailers, and you're going to get really frustrated throughout the day as they keep trying to pull off as you're casting. When it comes to swim jigs, again, this can be one of the absolute best and most universal baits that you can have in your tackle box, not only year round, but in the fall, especially when these bass are starting to move up and they're chasing more bait fish. My favorite swim jig, I love these little Sabotage swim jigs that Blue Rock Custom Tackle makes. They're available there at Ohio River Outdoors. I keep it really simple when it comes to my swim jigs. I primarily throw 3 colors. I like black and blue, I like white and chartreuse, and green pumpkin. When it comes to my trailers, I keep it accordingly. So if I'm throwing a black and blue, a lot of times I throw a black and blue trailer. Most of the time I throw a black and blue trailer. On this one here, I tried something a little different and had a green trailer. Whenever it comes to my chartreuse baits or my white and chartreuse ones, I typically throw a white or a chartreuse trailer. Whenever it comes to my green baits, I typically throw a green pumpkin trailer or something like that. One of my favorite baits to use are these little Strike King creature baits. I also like the grubs. I think that Mr. Twister baits work great as well, or even just a paddle tail swim bait. For a swim jig, I really like to have a heavier rod. I like a 7 foot to 7'4", medium heavy. I like a heavier line. Again, you're going to be throwing around a lot of cover and stuff like that, so the heavier your line is, the less likely you are to break off with those fish. Fluorocarbon, in my opinion, is the only way to go. Whenever it comes to the other two options, like a crankbait or a topwater bait, again, I use the polymer knot, just like I'd mentioned with all these tactics. I use a polymer knot. There's really no major adjustments that you're going to be able to make to a crankbait or to a popper, or even to one of these choppos, like I'd mentioned before in the video. I will say with the chopo, it is a good idea to put like a snap swivel or something to keep line twist out of it. But outside of picking your color selection, there's not a whole lot to go into with rigging these things up different ways outside of the knot that I prefer to use. I will say when it comes to color selection, in the fall, I go to a lot more of your natural colors like your greens or your browns, blacks and blues. This time of year, I do start to get away from like chartreuse colors, stuff like that. I will say that in some lakes, I have found the color white is an outstanding color in the fall. You really got to play around with that. A lot of that's going to depend on the lake that you're at, what kind of forage, what kind of feeder fish there are, bait fish there are, or what color the crawfish are. I will say this time of year, if you really pay attention, you'll notice that your crawfish, they do start to become a darker color just because of the water temperature cooling down. Some things will even start to become kind of a reddish color. A lot of those bright colors that you see in bait fish start to go away as the water temps cool down. So that's why I choose more natural colors. Final piece of advice I'm going to leave you all with is just get out on the water and go fishing. You're not going to do yourself any justice if you just sit here and watch these videos and you never actually go fish in the fall or fish whenever the water temps are cooler. I'll be the first to tell you that it wasn't that long ago that I was a very fair weather fisherman. I didn't like fishing in cold water because I didn't feel comfortable fishing in cold water. I didn't do good in cold water and I wasn't used to it. Now, don't get me wrong, the 3 baits I just mentioned aren't the only baits that you can use. There's so many other good options this year. But I'm telling you, get out in the water, give those baits a try, especially if they're not something that you used before, because the only way you're ever going to become better is just to get out there and get on the water. There's nothing that can beat time on the water and experience. I hope you all liked this video. If you did, make sure you're hitting that like and subscribe button, and I'll see you all next time.